Sometimes a single moment can shatter everything you thought you knew about someone. Sometimes that moment happens in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, when you least expect it. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old marketing executive whose ordinary Tuesday morning turned into a life-changing experience that would expose a dangerous predator, unite an entire community, and prove that one person's courage can save countless others from harm. What started as an unwanted touch from a stranger would spiral into a shocking discovery about a man who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Sarah had no idea that her split-second decision to fight back would not only protect her but also bring justice to dozens of other victims who had been suffering in silence. This is her story of survival, justice, and the unexpected strength found in the most frightening moments of our lives. Sarah Martinez walked briskly down Fifth Avenue, her heels clicking against the concrete as she balanced her phone between her ear and shoulder. The morning sun cast long shadows between the tall buildings of downtown Chicago, and the familiar sounds of traffic and construction filled the air. She was running late for her 9 a.m. meeting with a potential client, something that rarely happened to someone as organized as Sarah. At 28, Sarah had built a reputation as one of the most reliable marketing executives at her firm. Her colleagues often joked that she was never more than 5 minutes early to anything, but today was different. Her alarm had failed to go off, her coffee maker had broken, and now she was practically jogging down the street in her navy blue business suit, trying to finish a conference call with her boss while navigating the busy sidewalk. The man appeared out of nowhere. "This is out." Sarah first noticed him when she stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. He was standing uncomfortably close behind her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and hear his heavy breathing. She took a small step forward, assuming he was just another impatient commuter eager to cross the street. The city was full of people who didn't understand personal space, and after 5 years of living in Chicago, Sarah had learned to ignore most of it. But something felt wrong. The man was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and wearing a black jacket despite the warm September weather. Sarah caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of a store window. He wasn't looking at his phone like most people. He wasn't checking his watch or looking ahead at the traffic light. He was staring directly at her. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she pushed the feeling away. She was probably being paranoid. The city could make anyone feel watched sometimes. She adjusted her purse strap and focused on finishing her phone conversation with her boss, discussing the presentation she was about to give. The light changed and the crowd began moving across the street. Sarah fell into step with the other pedestrians, her heels creating a steady rhythm on the pavement. She could hear the man's footsteps behind her, matching her pace exactly. When she walked faster, he walked faster. When she slowed down slightly, he slowed down too. Her heart began to beat faster. Sarah ended her phone call and dropped her phone into her purse. She needed to focus on what was happening around her. The rational part of her mind tried to explain it away. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. Maybe it was a coincidence. But her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. She decided to test her suspicions. When she reached the next block, instead of continuing straight toward her office building, she turned right onto a side street. It was a longer route to her destination, but it would tell her if the man was really following her. She counted to 10 in her head before glancing back. He had turned right, too. The side street was quieter than the main avenue, with fewer people and less traffic. Sarah's breathing became shallow as she realized how vulnerable she was. The man was still behind her, still matching her pace, still staring. She could see his reflection in the windows of the shops they passed. His expression was focused, determined, like a predator stalking its prey. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could duck into one of the shops, but most of them weren't open yet. She could call 911, but what would she say? That a man was walking behind her. It wasn't technically a crime, and she worried the police would dismiss her concerns. She could run, but she was wearing heels and carrying a heavy briefcase. The man looked like he was in good shape and would easily catch up to her. She decided to keep walking and hope she could make it to her office building where there would be security guards and other people. It was still 3 blocks away. But if she could just hold on a little longer, she would be safe. The man had other plans. As Sarah walked past a narrow alley between 2 buildings, she felt a sudden violent tug on her hair. The force was so unexpected and so strong that she stumbled backward, dropping her briefcase and nearly falling to the ground. Her scalp burned with pain as thick fingers twisted themselves into her long brown hair, yanking her head back at an unnatural angle. For a moment, Sarah couldn't process what was happening. The world seemed to slow down around her. She could hear the sound of her briefcase hitting the concrete, the papers inside scattering in the morning breeze. She could smell the man's cologne stronger now, mixed with sweat and something else she couldn't identify. She could feel his breath on her neck as he pulled her toward the dark alley. Then the shock wore off, and pure terror flooded through her system. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but the man's free hand clamped down over her lips before any sound could escape. His grip was impossibly strong, and she could taste the salt from his palm. He began dragging her backward into the alley, away from the street where someone might see them. This was it. This was how she was going to die. But somewhere in the depths of her fear, Sarah found something she didn't know she possessed. It was a fierce, burning anger that cut through the terror like a knife. How dare this stranger think he could just grab her off the street? How dare he assume she would be an easy victim? How dare he try to take away her life, her future, her dreams? Sarah had always been small, barely 5'4", and weighing less than 120 pounds. She had never been in a fight in her life. She avoided confrontation whenever possible, and had often been described as gentle and soft-spoken. But in that moment, something primal awakened inside her. She bit down on the man's hand as hard as she could, tasting blood as her teeth broke through his skin. He jerked his hand away with a yelp of pain and surprise, and Sarah immediately opened her mouth and screamed louder than she had ever screamed in her life. The sound echoed off the buildings around them, sharp and piercing and impossible to ignore. The man tried to grab her mouth again, but Sarah was ready for him now. She swung her purse with all her strength, the heavy leather bag connecting with his face with a satisfying thump. Sarah had always carried everything in her purse: her laptop charger, her water bottle, her makeup bag, her wallet stuffed with credit cards and coins. What had once been a source of teasing from her friends now became her lifeline. The purse was heavy enough to stagger the man, and she used the moment of his confusion to break free from his grip. More importantly, her screams had attracted attention. A woman across the street stopped walking and looked in their direction. A man getting into his car paused with his keys in his hand. A jogger who had been running down the sidewalk changed direction and started running toward them instead of away. The attacker realized that his surprise advantage was gone. People were looking. People were coming to help. His easy victim had turned into a fighter, and his quick crime had turned into a public spectacle. He released Sarah's hair and took a step back, his eyes darting between her and the approaching strangers. For the first time since the attack began, Sarah could see his face clearly. He was younger than she had initially thought, maybe early 30s, with pale skin and dark eyes that held no warmth or humanity. There was something cold and calculating about his expression, even in his moment of panic. Sarah's instincts told her to run, but she found herself frozen in place, staring at the man who had just tried to kidnap her. She wanted to remember every detail of his face, every feature that might help the police identify him later. She noticed a small scar on his left cheek and a tattoo barely visible at his collar line. The jogger reached them first. A young man in his 20s, wearing running clothes and looking ready for a fight. Behind him came the woman from across the street, already holding her phone and dialing 911. The man who had been getting into his car was running toward them too, shouting something Sarah couldn't quite make out over the ringing in her ears. The attacker looked at the growing crowd of witnesses and made a decision. Without saying a word, he turned and ran down the alley, disappearing into the maze of narrow passages between the buildings. His footsteps echoed off the brick walls for a few seconds before fading into silence. Sarah stood there shaking, her hair disheveled and her suit wrinkled, trying to catch her breath and process what had just happened. The jogger put a gentle hand on her shoulder and asked if she was okay. The woman with the phone was speaking rapidly to the 911 operator, giving their location and describing what she had witnessed. Other people began gathering around, offering help and asking questions. But Sarah couldn't speak. The adrenaline that had carried her through the attack was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a trembling that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. She sank down onto the curb, her legs no longer able to support her weight. The police arrived within minutes, followed by an ambulance and what seemed like half the emergency services in the city. Sarah found herself surrounded by uniformed officers, paramedics, and concerned strangers, all asking questions she wasn't sure she could answer. Detective Maria Santos was the first investigator to arrive on the scene. She was a small woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put Sarah at ease. Detective Santos gently dispersed the crowd and sat down on the curb next to Sarah, speaking in a quiet voice that only she could hear. Detective Santos explained that she specialized in crimes against women and that Sarah was safe now. She asked if Sarah felt comfortable giving a statement about what had happened, and assured her that they could take as much time as she needed. Sarah nodded and began telling her story, starting with the feeling of being followed and ending with the man's escape down the alley. As she spoke, she was surprised by how clearly she could remember everything. The man's height and build, the smell of his cologne, the way his eyes had looked when he realized people were watching. Detective Santos took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions, but never pushed Sarah to remember more than she was comfortable sharing. When Sarah mentioned the scar and the partial tattoo, the detective's expression grew more serious. After taking Sarah's statement, Detective Santos spoke quietly with the other officers before returning to Sarah's side. She explained that they would need Sarah to come to the police station to look at some photographs, and that they would also need her to work with a sketch artist to create a composite drawing of her attacker. Sarah agreed, though part of her just wanted to go home and pretend the whole thing had never happened. She called her office to cancel her meetings for the day and asked her friend Jennifer to meet her at the police station for moral support. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, photographs, and paperwork. The sketch artist was a patient woman who worked with Sarah to create a detailed drawing of the attacker's face. When they were finished, Sarah was amazed by how accurate the sketch looked. It captured not just the man's physical features, but something about his expression that sent chills down her spine all over again. Detective Santos reviewed the sketch and made another phone call. When she hung up, she turned to Sarah with an expression that was both excited and concerned. She told Sarah that the man in the sketch looked very similar to someone they had been trying to identify in connection with several other attacks in the area. If it was the same person, Sarah might have just helped them identify a serial predator who had been terrorizing women for months. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that she might have helped stop someone dangerous, but horror at the thought that other women had gone through what she had experienced and possibly worse. Detective Santos explained that they would need to compare Sarah's description and the sketch to the other cases, and that the investigation was likely to take some time. She gave Sarah her card and told her to call immediately if she remembered anything else or if she felt unsafe for any reason. As Sarah finally left the police station that evening, accompanied by her friend Jennifer, she felt like she was walking into a completely different world than the one she had woken up in that morning. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The sidewalks, where she had walked confidently for years, now seemed full of shadows and potential threats. The sounds of the city that had once been comforting background noise now made her jump. Jennifer drove Sarah home and stayed with her that night, making tea and ordering takeout and trying to help her process what had happened. They talked for hours about the attack, about Sarah's quick thinking, about how differently things could have ended. But as Sarah lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and sound in her apartment building, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The man had escaped, which meant he was still out there somewhere. He had seen her face just as clearly as she had seen his. He knew that she was the one who had fought back, who had drawn attention, who had ruined his plans. What if he came back for her? That question would haunt Sarah's dreams and occupy her thoughts for the days and weeks to come. But she had no idea that her decision to fight back had set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of dozens of other women who had been living in fear for far too long. The sketch that Sarah had helped create would soon be distributed to police departments across 3 states. Detective Santos would spend the next several days comparing the details of Sarah's attack to a growing file of similar incidents. And somewhere in the city, a dangerous man would be making plans to ensure that no one would ever be able to identify him again. The real story was just beginning. Detective Maria Santos stared at the evidence board in the conference room, her coffee growing cold in her hand as she studied the timeline that had been consuming her thoughts for the past week. 7 photographs were pinned to the board, 7 different women whose lives had been forever changed by encounters with the same predator. Sarah Martinez's sketch was in the center, surrounded by incident reports, witness statements, and forensic evidence that painted a disturbing picture of escalating violence. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the room as Detective Santos reviewed each case file once more. She had been working crimes against women for 8 years, but something about this particular investigation felt different. The man they were hunting wasn't a disorganized opportunist or someone acting on impulse. He was methodical, patient, and getting bolder with each attack. The first incident had occurred 6 months earlier in Lincoln Park. A 24-year-old graduate student named Ashley Chen had been walking to her car after an evening class when a man approached her from behind and grabbed her arm. Ashley managed to break free and run, but not before getting a good look at her attacker's face. She had filed a report, worked with a sketch artist, and provided a detailed statement, but without any physical evidence or witnesses, the case had gone nowhere. 2 months later, Rebecca Williams was attacked while jogging in Grant Park early on a Sunday morning. This time, the man had been more aggressive, grabbing her hair and trying to drag her into a secluded area near the lake. Rebecca fought back fiercely, kicking and screaming until other joggers came to her aid. The attacker fled, but not before Rebecca had managed to scratch his face, leaving marks that would be visible for days. The third victim was Maria Gonzalez, a 31-year-old nurse who was walking home from her night shift at the hospital. The attack happened in a parking garage, where the man had apparently been waiting for her. He grabbed her from behind and covered her mouth, but Maria had been trained in basic self-defense as part of her job and managed to elbow him hard enough to break free. Security cameras in the garage captured a figure running away, but the image was too blurry to make a positive identification. Each subsequent attack showed the same pattern. A lone woman, usually walking alone in the early morning or evening hours. The attacker always approached from behind, always tried to grab their hair or arms, always attempted to drag them to a more secluded location. And in every case, the man fled as soon as the victim fought back or attracted attention. Detective Santos had initially treated these as separate incidents. Random crimes by different perpetrators were unfortunately common in a city the size of Chicago. It wasn't until Sarah Martinez's attack and the detailed sketch she had provided that the pattern became impossible to ignore. The sketch had been the breakthrough they needed. When Detective Santos compared Sarah's description to the previous cases, the similarities were striking. The height, the build, the dark hair, the cold expression. Even more telling were the small details that victims often remembered. This is the book. It's about history. The scar on the left cheek that Ashley Chen had mentioned, the cologne that Rebecca Williams had smelled, the tattoo at the collar line that Maria Gonzalez had glimpsed. But it was the forensic evidence that had convinced Detective Santos they were dealing with a serial offender. DNA samples collected from Rebecca Williams's fingernails matched skin cells found on Maria Gonzalez's jacket. The bite mark that Sarah Martinez had left on her attacker's hand matched wounds described in 2 of the other cases. Armed with this evidence, Detective Santos had expanded her search beyond Chicago's city limits. She contacted police departments in nearby suburbs and discovered 3 more cases that fit the same pattern. In Evanston, a Northwestern University professor had been attacked while walking to her car after a faculty meeting. In Oak Park, a high school teacher had fought off an attacker while walking her dog. In Naperville, a real estate agent had been grabbed outside a house she was showing to potential buyers. The geographic spread told Detective Santos that their suspect was highly mobile and probably had a vehicle. The timing of the attack suggested he might have a job with flexible hours or periods of unemployment. The locations indicated someone familiar with the Chicago area, who knew which neighborhoods to target for maximum opportunity and minimum risk. Detective Santos had assembled a task force of investigators from multiple jurisdictions, and they were making progress. They had identified several persons of interest based on the physical description and known criminal history. They had established a timeline of the attacks and were looking for connections between the victims and locations. They had even found a few witnesses who remembered seeing a man matching the suspect's description in the areas where attacks had occurred, but they still didn't have a name. That changed on a Thursday morning when Detective Santos received a phone call that would crack the case wide open. The caller was Dr. Jennifer Park, a psychologist who worked with trauma victims at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Dr. Park explained that she had been following the news coverage of the attacks and wanted to share information about a patient she had been treating. The patient was Lisa Thompson, a 26-year-old marketing coordinator who had been attacked 8 months earlier in Milwaukee. Lisa had moved to Chicago shortly after the incident, hoping to start fresh in a new city, but the trauma had followed her. She had been seeing Dr. Park for PTSD treatment related to her attack. Dr. Park explained that Lisa's case had some unique details that might be relevant to the investigation. With Lisa's permission, she was willing to share information that could help identify the attacker. Detective Santos immediately drove to the hospital to meet with both women. Lisa Thompson was a petite blonde woman with nervous energy and intelligent eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning her surroundings. She sat in Dr. Park's office with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, speaking in a quiet voice about the night that had changed her life. Lisa's attack had been different from the others in several key ways. Instead of approaching from behind, the man had confronted her face-to-face as she left a restaurant after having dinner with friends. He had claimed to know her, calling her by a name that wasn't hers and insisting that she had promised to meet him somewhere. When Lisa tried to explain that he had mistaken her for someone else, he became aggressive and grabbed her arm. The attack had taken place in a well-lit area with several witnesses,
which forced the man to be more careful about his approach. Instead of trying to drag Lisa to a secluded location, he had attempted to convince bystanders that she was his girlfriend and that they were having a relationship dispute.
The ruse might have worked if Lisa hadn't been with friends who knew the man was lying, but the most important detail was what happened after the attack was interrupted. As the man fled the scene, one of Lisa's friends had managed to take a photo of him with her phone. The image was dark and slightly blurry, but it clearly showed the suspect's face from a side angle as he looked back over his shoulder. Lisa had provided the photo to Milwaukee police, but without additional evidence or similar cases to compare it to, the investigation had stalled. The man had disappeared, and Lisa had eventually decided to move to Chicago to escape the memories and start over. Detective Santos studied the photo on Dr. Park's computer screen, her pulse quickening as she recognized the features from Sarah Martinez's sketch. The scar on the left cheek was clearly visible, and the angle of the photo showed part of the tattoo that several victims had mentioned. But more than that, there was something about the man's expression, the cold calculation in his eyes, that matched every description they had collected. With Lisa's permission, Detective Santos sent the photo to the FBI's facial recognition database and to investigators in the other jurisdictions working the case. The response came back within hours. The man in the photo was David Mitchell, a 34-year-old construction worker with a criminal history dating back over a decade. Mitchell had been arrested multiple times for harassment, stalking, and assault charges, but had never been convicted of a felony. He had served short jail sentences and completed court-ordered counseling programs, but had never been required to provide DNA samples or fingerprints to law enforcement databases. He was exactly the type of offender who could operate under the radar while escalating his criminal behavior. The address on file for Mitchell was in Gary, Indiana, about an hour's drive from Chicago. Detective Santos coordinated with local law enforcement to set up surveillance on the address while her team gathered additional evidence for an arrest warrant. But when officers arrived at Mitchell's last known address, they discovered he had moved out months earlier without leaving a forwarding address. His former landlord said Mitchell had paid his rent in cash and kept to himself, rarely speaking to neighbors or causing any problems. The construction company where he had worked said he had quit without notice around the same time he moved out of his apartment. David Mitchell had effectively vanished. Detective Santos expanded the search, working with FBI investigators who specialized in tracking fugitives. They discovered that Mitchell had been using multiple identities and fake social security numbers to find work and housing. He had moved frequently over the past year, never staying in one place long enough to establish a paper trail. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the attacks in Chicago and Milwaukee. As word spread through law enforcement networks, reports came in from police departments across the Midwest. Mitchell was suspected in similar attacks in Indianapolis, Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis. In each city, he had targeted women walking alone, used the same methods of approach and escape, and disappeared before police could identify him. The scope of Mitchell's crimes was staggering. Over a period of 3 years, he had potentially attacked dozens of women across multiple states. Some victims had never reported their attacks out of fear or shame. Others had filed reports that were treated as isolated incidents because no one had connected them to a larger pattern. Detective Santos worked with FBI behavioral analysts to develop a profile of Mitchell's likely next moves. The analysis suggested that he would continue targeting women in urban areas where he could blend into crowds and escape easily. The increased police attention in Chicago might drive him to a new city, but his pattern suggested he would return to familiar hunting grounds eventually. The breakthrough in locating Mitchell came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Williams, the jogger who had been attacked in Grant Park, called Detective Santos with information that she had just remembered during a therapy session. After her attack, Rebecca had noticed a white pickup truck parked near the area where she had been jogging. She hadn't thought it was significant at the time, but her therapist had helped her recall that she had seen the same truck parked in different locations around the park on several occasions before the attack. Rebecca had even noticed the truck's license plate because it had a distinctive combination of letters that reminded her of her brother's initials. She had written the number down in her running log as a way of tracking whether the truck belonged to someone who regularly used the park. Detective Santos ran the license plate number and discovered it was registered to a David Mitchell in Hammond, Indiana. The registration address was different from any of the previous addresses they had on file, suggesting that Mitchell had been more careful about hiding his identity in recent months. Surveillance teams were immediately dispatched to the Hammond address, which turned out to be a small apartment building in a run-down neighborhood near the state border. Mitchell's apartment was on the second floor, with a view of the parking lot where his white pickup truck was parked. Detective Santos coordinated with local SWAT teams and federal agents to plan Mitchell's arrest. They wanted to take him into custody without giving him a chance to flee or destroy evidence. The operation was scheduled for early morning when Mitchell would be most likely to be home and least likely to have an escape route planned. But as the arrest teams prepared to move in, they discovered that Mitchell wasn't alone in his apartment. Through surveillance, they observed a young woman entering and leaving the building with Mitchell over a period of several days. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s and showed signs of being under Mitchell's control. The discovery complicated the arrest plan significantly. If the woman was being held against her will, a forced entry could put her life in danger. If she was there voluntarily, she might still be at risk if Mitchell decided to use her as a hostage or shield. Detective Santos worked with FBI hostage negotiators to develop a strategy that would allow them to arrest Mitchell while ensuring the woman's safety. They decided to wait for an opportunity when Mitchell left the apartment alone, then move in to arrest him away from the building. The opportunity came on a Tuesday morning when Mitchell was observed leaving the apartment building alone and walking toward a nearby convenience store. Arrest teams moved into position as Mitchell entered the store, surrounding the building and blocking all potential escape routes. Detective Santos was part of the team that entered the store to make the arrest. She had studied Mitchell's photograph so many times that she recognized him instantly, despite his attempt to disguise his appearance with a baseball cap and sunglasses. He was standing in the checkout line buying cigarettes and energy drinks, looking like any other customer making a routine purchase. The arrest happened quickly and without incident. Mitchell showed no resistance as officers approached him, almost as if he had been expecting them. He was handcuffed and read his rights while curious customers and store employees watched from a safe distance. As Mitchell was being led away in handcuffs, Detective Santos felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. They had caught a dangerous predator who had terrorized women across multiple states. But the investigation was far from over. They still needed to search his apartment, interview the woman who had been staying with him, and build a case that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The apartment search revealed evidence that exceeded Detective Santos's worst expectations. Mitchell had kept detailed records of his attacks, including photographs of his victims taken without their knowledge, maps of locations where he had stalked women, and notebooks full of disturbing fantasies about violence against women. Most shocking was a collection of personal items that Mitchell had apparently taken from his victims as trophies: jewelry, hair clips, pieces of clothing, and other small objects that had belonged to women he had attacked. Some of the items matched descriptions from police reports, but others suggested there were victims who had never come forward. The young woman in the apartment was identified as Michelle Roberts, a 19-year-old who had been reported missing by her family in Tennessee 3 months earlier. Michelle was physically unharmed, but showed signs of psychological trauma consistent with prolonged captivity and manipulation. She was taken to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. As news of Mitchell's arrest spread, Detective Santos's phone began ringing with calls from police departments across the country. Investigators who had been working similar cases wanted to compare notes and evidence. Victims who had never reported their attacks came forward to share their stories. Families of missing women wondered if Mitchell might be connected to their loved ones' disappearances. The investigation into David Mitchell's crimes would eventually span 7 years and involve law enforcement agencies from 12 different states. He would be charged with over 30 felonies, including kidnapping, sexual assault, stalking, and attempted murder. The evidence collected from his apartment would help solve dozens of cold cases and bring closure to families who had been searching for answers for years. But for Detective Santos, the most important part of the investigation was yet to come. Each of Mitchell's victims deserved to know that their attacker had been caught and would never hurt anyone again. They deserved to have their voices heard and their courage recognized. The first person Detective Santos called was Sarah Martinez. Sarah Martinez sat in the courthouse waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched other witnesses and family members file past. 6 months had passed since David Mitchell's arrest, and today was the day she had been both anticipating and dreading. Today she would face her attacker in court and tell her story to a jury that would decide his fate. The past months had been a whirlwind of interviews, depositions, and meetings with prosecutors. Sarah had learned that she was just one of 37 women who would be testifying against Mitchell during his trial. 37 women whose lives had been forever changed by a man who saw them as nothing more than prey. Well, for them. Detective Santos had called Sarah personally the morning of Mitchell's arrest, sharing the news that the man who had tried to kidnap her had finally been caught. Sarah remembered sinking into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and emotion she hadn't expected. For months, she had been looking over her shoulder, afraid that Mitchell would return to finish what he had started. Now finally, she could breathe again. But the relief had been complicated by everything she learned about Mitchell's other crimes. The detective had explained that Sarah's decision to fight back and her detailed description of her attacker had been crucial in identifying him. Her courage had potentially saved dozens of other women from becoming victims. The weight of that responsibility was something Sarah was still learning to carry. As she waited to be called to testify, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that September morning when Mitchell had grabbed her hair. The attack had shattered her sense of safety and forced her to confront fears she never knew she had, but it had also revealed a strength and determination that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. In the weeks following the attack, Sarah had struggled with anxiety and panic attacks. Simple activities like walking to work or going to the grocery store had become overwhelming challenges. She had started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, who specialized in helping trauma survivors reclaim their lives. Dr. Chen had helped Sarah understand that her response to the trauma was completely normal, and that healing would be a gradual process. She had taught Sarah breathing techniques and grounding exercises that helped manage her anxiety. Most importantly, she had helped Sarah realize that surviving the attack didn't make her weak or vulnerable. It made her a survivor. The therapy sessions had been difficult but transformative. Sarah had learned to separate the attack from her daily life, to recognize triggers before they overwhelmed her, and to celebrate small victories in her recovery. She had also connected with other survivors through a support group that Dr. Chen facilitated. Meeting other women who had experienced similar attacks had been both heartbreaking and healing. Sarah heard stories of incredible courage and resilience, of women who had fought back against attackers, who had rebuilt their lives after trauma, and who had found ways to help other survivors. She realized she wasn't alone in her experience, and that there was a whole community of people who understood what she had gone through. One of the most meaningful connections Sarah had made was with Rebecca Williams, the jogger who had been attacked in Grant Park. Rebecca had reached out to Sarah after learning that her remembered license plate number had led to Mitchell's arrest. The two women had met for coffee and discovered they had more in common than just surviving Mitchell's attacks. Both were young professionals trying to build careers in Chicago. Both had initially blamed themselves for not being more careful or aware of their surroundings. Both had struggled with the feeling that they should have done something different to prevent their attacks. And both had learned through therapy that none of it had been their fault. Rebecca and Sarah had become close friends, supporting each other through the investigation process and the upcoming trial. They had attended court hearings together, met with prosecutors as a team, and provided emotional support when the legal process became overwhelming. The friendship had been a lifeline for both women. Having someone who truly understood the experience of being attacked by Mitchell made the healing process less isolating. They could talk about their fears and frustrations without having to explain or justify their feelings. They could celebrate progress together and provide comfort during setbacks. As the trial date approached, Sarah had wrestled with whether she wanted to testify. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Martinez, no relation to Sarah, had explained that her testimony wasn't strictly necessary for a conviction. They had physical evidence, witness testimony, and Mitchell's own recorded confessions to several of the attacks. Sarah could decline to testify without affecting the prosecution's case, but Sarah had ultimately decided that she wanted to speak not just for herself but for all the women who had suffered at Mitchell's hands. She wanted to look him in the eye and show him that his victims were not powerless. She wanted the jury to see the human impact of his crimes, and she wanted to reclaim her voice after months of feeling silenced by trauma. The courtroom was packed when Sarah was finally called to testify. She could see Mitchell sitting at the defense table, looking smaller and less threatening than she remembered. He was clean-shaven now, wearing a suit and tie, looking like any other defendant rather than the monster who had haunted her dreams for months. As Sarah walked to the witness stand, she caught sight of the gallery filled with other victims and their supporters. She saw Rebecca Williams in the front row, offering an encouraging smile. She saw Detective Santos, who had become not just an investigator but a friend. She saw her parents, who had flown in from California to support her, and her colleagues from work who had never questioned her need for time off during the investigation. The prosecutor began with basic questions about Sarah's background and her activities on the morning of the attack. Sarah's voice was quiet at first, but as she began telling her story, her confidence grew. She described the feeling of being followed, the moment Mitchell grabbed her hair, and her decision to fight back rather than submit. As Sarah testified, she could see members of the jury leaning forward, paying close attention to every detail. Some of them looked angry as she described the attack. Others looked sad or disturbed. But all of them seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened to her. The defense attorney's cross-examination was challenging but not unexpected. He tried to suggest that Sarah might have misidentified her attacker, that the stress of the situation could have affected her memory,
that her decision to fight back might have escalated a situation that could have ended peacefully.
Sarah had prepared for these questions with the prosecutor and her therapist. She answered calmly and clearly, sticking to the facts of what she had experienced and observed. When the defense attorney suggested that she might have overreacted to what could have been a case of mistaken identity, Sarah looked directly at him and said, "No one grabs a stranger's hair by mistake." The moment that made the biggest impact on the jury came when the prosecutor asked Sarah to identify her attacker. Sarah looked across the courtroom at Mitchell, meeting his eyes for the first time since the morning of the attack. He stared back at her with the same cold expression she remembered, showing no remorse or emotion. Sarah pointed directly at Mitchell and said, "That's him. That's the man who tried to kidnap me." Her voice was strong and clear, carrying across the silent courtroom with absolute certainty. The defense attorney tried to challenge her identification, asking if she was certain it was the same person despite the time that had passed and the changes in his appearance. Sarah never wavered in her response. She had seen Mitchell's face clearly during the attack, had worked with a sketch artist to capture every detail, had studied his photograph when he was arrested, and had no doubt whatsoever about his identity. After Sarah's testimony, she was allowed to remain in the courtroom to hear the other witnesses. Over the next 2 weeks, she listened as woman after woman took the stand to tell similar stories. Each testimony revealed new details about Mitchell's methods and his escalating pattern of violence. Some of the victims had been attacked multiple times by Mitchell before he moved on to new hunting grounds. Others had been stalked for weeks before the actual assault. Several women testified about seeing Mitchell watching them in the days and weeks before their attacks, gathering information about their routines and identifying opportunities to strike. The most powerful testimony came from Michelle Roberts, the young woman who had been found in Mitchell's apartment. Michelle explained how Mitchell had initially approached her at a bus stop in Nashville, claiming to be a friend of a friend who could give her a ride. She had been homeless and desperate, making her an easy target for his manipulation. Michelle described months of psychological abuse and control that had left her afraid to leave or call for help. Mitchell had convinced her that no one would believe her story and that she would be arrested if police found her. He had moved her frequently to avoid detection and had threatened to kill her family if she ever tried to escape. The testimony revealed Mitchell's crimes went far beyond the attempted kidnappings and assaults that had been reported. He was a sophisticated predator who had developed methods for identifying, stalking, and controlling his victims. He had used their vulnerabilities against them and had shown no mercy for their suffering. As the trial progressed, Sarah began to understand the full scope of Mitchell's impact on the community. The attacks had created a climate of fear that extended far beyond his actual victims. Women throughout the Chicago area had changed their routines, avoided walking alone, and lived with constant vigilance because of his crimes. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. In addition to victim testimony, they presented physical evidence that linked Mitchell to multiple crime scenes. DNA evidence, fingerprints, personal items found in his possession, and his own recorded confessions created an irrefutable pattern of guilt. The defense team's strategy focused on trying to minimize Mitchell's culpability by suggesting he had mental health issues that affected his judgment. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about personality disorders and impulse control problems. They argued that Mitchell needed treatment rather than punishment, but the prosecution countered with evidence of Mitchell's careful planning and methodical approach to his crimes. They showed that he had researched his victims, planned his attacks, and taken steps to avoid detection. His behavior showed clear intent and premeditation rather than impulsive actions driven by mental illness. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. As the foreman read the verdicts aloud, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she had been carrying. Mitchell would never again have the opportunity to hurt another woman. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Victims were given the opportunity to make impact statements about how Mitchell's crimes had affected their lives. Sarah had debated whether to speak at sentencing, but ultimately decided she wanted to address the court one final time. Standing at the podium in front of Judge Patricia Williams, Sarah spoke directly to Mitchell for the first time. She told him that his actions had changed her life, but they had not defined her. She explained that she had found strength she never knew she possessed, and that she would not allow fear to control her future. Sarah also addressed the other victims in the courtroom, thanking them for their courage in coming forward and testifying.
She acknowledged that healing would be a lifelong process for all of them, but that they had already taken the most important step by refusing to remain silent. Judge Williams sentenced Mitchell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She cited the severity and scope of his crimes, his lack of remorse, and the need to protect the community from future attacks.
She also commended the victims for their bravery in coming forward and testifying. As Mitchell was led away in handcuffs, Sarah felt a sense of closure that she had been seeking for over a year. The man who had tried to destroy her life was finally being held accountable for his actions. Justice had been served not just for her, but for all the women whose lives he had impacted. The months following Mitchell's sentencing brought new challenges and opportunities for Sarah. She had returned to work at her marketing firm but found herself increasingly drawn to advocacy work with other crime victims. She began volunteering with the same support group where she had found healing, helping other women navigate the legal system and recover from trauma.
Sarah also became involved in legislative advocacy, working with organizations that pushed for better funding for victim services and improved training for law enforcement officers who work with sexual assault cases. She testified before state legislative committees about the importance of taking victim reports seriously and conducting thorough investigations.
The experience of surviving Mitchell's attack and testifying at his trial had given Sarah a platform and a voice that she felt compelled to use for positive change. She began speaking at conferences and training sessions for police officers, prosecutors, and victim advocates.
Her story had become a powerful tool for educating others about the realities of violence against women.
One of Sarah's most meaningful projects was working with Detective Santos to develop new protocols for investigating serial crimes against women. They collaborated on training materials that helped investigators recognize patterns in seemingly unrelated attacks and coordinate information across jurisdictions. The partnership between Sarah and Detective Santos had evolved into a friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting other potential victims. Detective Santos often said that Sarah's courage in fighting back and providing detailed information had been the key to stopping Mitchell before he could claim more victims.
2 years after Mitchell's sentencing, Sarah received a letter from a young woman named Amanda Torres. Amanda explained that she had been walking home from class when a man approached her from behind and tried to grab her hair.
But because of news coverage about Mitchell's case and Sarah's advocacy work, Amanda had been aware of his tactics and was prepared to fight back. Amanda had escaped her attacker and provided police with a description that led to the arrest of another serial predator.
She wrote to thank Sarah for sharing her story and helping to educate other women about how to recognize and respond to potential attacks. Letters like Amanda's reminded Sarah why her advocacy work was so important.
Every woman who avoided becoming a victim because she was aware and prepared represented a victory against predators who counted on fear and silence to protect them. Sarah's relationship with Rebecca Williams had also continued to grow stronger over the years.
The two friends had started a nonprofit organization called Survivors Speak, which provided support services to women who had experienced attacks and helped them navigate the criminal justice system.
The organization grew rapidly, with volunteers who were survivors themselves providing peer support and guidance to newly traumatized women. They offered practical help like accompanying victims to court hearings and medical appointments, as well as emotional support through support groups and counseling referrals.
Survivors Speak also worked on prevention education, teaching self-defense classes and awareness workshops at colleges, workplaces, and community centers. Sarah and Rebecca often co-presented these programs, sharing their experiences and demonstrating that survival was possible.
One of the most rewarding aspects of the organization was connecting with other survivors who had found their voices after traumatic experiences. Sarah met women who had survived domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other forms of victimization. Each story reinforced her belief that survivors had unique insights and strengths that could help others heal. As Sarah reflected on her journey from victim to survivor to advocate, she realized that Mitchell's attack had ultimately led her to her life's purpose. While she would never be grateful for the trauma she had experienced, she had found meaning in using her experience to help others. The scar on her scalp where Mitchell had grabbed her hair had faded over time, but Sarah sometimes touched it as a reminder of how much she had overcome. It represented not just the moment her life had been threatened, but the moment she had discovered her own strength and resilience. Sarah's story had become a testament to the power of fighting back, not just in the moment of attack, but in the aftermath, when survivors had to rebuild their lives and find their voices again. Her decision to testify had helped send a dangerous predator to prison for life. Her advocacy work had helped other survivors find healing and justice. Most importantly, Sarah's courage had created ripple effects that extended far beyond her own experience. Every woman who fought back because she had heard Sarah's story, every investigator who recognized a pattern because of Sarah's detailed testimony, every survivor who found strength in Sarah's example represented another victory against those who would prey on the innocent. David Mitchell had tried to make Sarah a victim, but she had chosen to become a survivor instead. And in doing so, she had helped create a world where other women could make that same choice, armed with knowledge, support, and the understanding that they were never alone in their fight for justice and healing.
The consequences of Mitchell's actions that September morning had indeed been far greater than he could have imagined, but they were consequences of justice, healing, and hope, rather than the fear and silence he had tried to create.
Sarah Martinez had grabbed back her power, her voice, and her future, and she was using all three to ensure that no other woman would have to face what she had faced alone. He grabbed her hair without warning, not knowing the consequences,